Okay, welcome back. So we did a lot of work yesterday to show you how to prepare Strawberry Rhubarb Mead. And in that process, we put all the ingredients together inside this fermenter bucket. We followed this recipe, and for those who noticed, we had a little trouble with the sugars yesterday. I have updated this recipe to show that I have included 2 to 2 1/4 pounds of honey, and it was needed because probably the fluid level was a little higher, and I needed a more concentration of honey to get our specific gravity up to the proper level. We needed to start specific gravity at 1.090, which we did. Today we're going to talk about the final stage of getting to fermentation. Here I have a packet of yeast. This is white wine yeast, EC1118. This is what I've chosen to use with this batch of mead. I'm going to demonstrate how we're going to rehydrate this yeast. We're going to check this must, and we're going to aerate this must. Aeration will be necessary in order for the fermentation process to proceed properly. Okay, and in this process, I want you to understand that fermentation it requires basically 5 things. You have to have a solution of water with sugars at the right level, nutrients for the yeast to properly grow and actually get healthy, and they will reproduce themselves. So you'll have more yeast than what you have in this packet here. The must, after the yeast is pitched, must be kept at the right temperature. It should be probably 60-70 degrees, in that range. Sometimes you can ferment at lower temperatures, sometimes maybe a little higher than 70, but you probably don't want to go much higher. And then we also yesterday checked the pH, make sure the pH in this case was no lower than 3.8. All right, so when the fermentation happens, you need 4 stages of the fermentation. After we pitch the yeast and aerate, get everything set, seal this with a airlock. There will be a lag phase where the yeast will get acclimatized to the solution. The second phase is what's called a respiration phase. Now, the yeast need oxygen to multiply. It's basically an aerobic phase. That means there's oxygen in the liquid. And that's why we do aeration, put oxygen into this must when the yeast is first added, okay? And during that phase, the yeast will reproduce, and they will also grow to be adult yeast and be healthy. The third phase is the actual fermentation. When the actual fermentation is taking place, you start entering what's called the anaerobic phase. That means the oxygen gets depleted by the yeast as they're growing and proceeding to reproduce. Once the oxygen is depleted, the yeast that are there now are basically living off of the sugars that are in the solution. And they are going to actually ingest the sugars, and then they're going to break them down. The fermentation phase is the actual process of breaking down the sugars into carbon dioxide, which releases as bubbles in the liquid, comes up through this airlock, and it bubbles out. The other thing that makes this so wonderful is the split of the sugars produces alcohol. So with the right amount of sugars, the right amount of alcohol produced in this will be approximately 11-12%. Okay, so the final phase of the fermentation process is called flocculation. And it's the process where the yeast start to die off. They reach their alcohol tolerance level, and then it becomes pretty hard for them to live in the solution because the alcohol is up to a level where they don't live very well. They've also gotten old, and they start to die. They're basically depleted. So they kind of flock together, they clump together, and they start precipitating out and dropping to the bottom of your solution. At that point, you're kind of selecting, because the stronger yeast can still live in maybe a little bit of higher alcohol. The weaker yeast are going to die and precipitate and flocculate. So the process will kind of come to a slowing phase when you notice it's not bubbling as much. Generally in my work, it takes a week or two. Sometimes it happens fast, sometimes it happens slower. But you need to be careful, because after, say, your initial fermentation is done, and you may rack this liquid off into a jar. The first racking will take all of the liquid off of all the flocculated yeast and everything at the bottom of the fermenter pail. So you're going to put it into a jar. But that fermentation is not done. Those yeast that are strong, that are more viable at a higher alcohol content and all, they still go on, and that solution is still fermenting. It can ferment, actually. In the case of mead, I have a jar that has been fermenting for 4 or 5 months. That's not abnormal, because we're not using a simple sugar. We're using a complex sugar in the honey, and that sugar can be very difficult for the yeast to break down. But the stronger yeast will survive, and they will live in a higher alcohol solution, and they will continue to try to break down any sugars. So that's one of the reasons why making mead is a much longer term process than, say, making wine. Mead should be put in racking bottles or jars and jugs, and it should be left for at least 9 months, a year, at which time you'll notice you're getting really to an end, and that's pretty much what we do. Now, we do measure the sugars. We can measure them when the yeast gets down to the end and we notice all the sugars are mostly gone. We can also monitor the process as it's fermenting with the bubbling. It'll bubble very strongly if it's got a lot of yeast in there and they're all eating up the sugars and producing a lot of carbon dioxide and alcohol at one time. That'll happen in the first week or two, and then it'll slow down, and it'll get down to where most of the sugars are gone, and now you're going to be racking into jars. Okay, I'd like to show you this process of rehydrating the yeast. This is the yeast, EC1118, that I'm going to use. Comes in a dry packet. This has to be refrigerated, by the way. If you buy some at the store, it'll be in a refrigerator, and you bring it home and keep it in the refrigerator. I take it out of the refrigerator, say 30 minutes to an hour before I'm going to use it. I take distilled water that I've been using, and I will add a little bit to this jelly jar, put it in the microwave, heat it for 10 or 15 seconds. It'll get hot quick, and then put the thermometer in. So usually you'll get it up to over 100, and then you'll have to bring it down. According to the instructions, follow the instructions on the back of the package. You need to get the temperature of your hydration to about 40 degrees centigrade. So if I'm a little over, I'll just add more cool water and let it drop down, stir it up and check it. And then when I get to the right temperature, and right now I'm about at 41, so I'm in good shape. So we have the proper temperature, and according to the instructions, we want to use 50 milliliters, which is why I have this little measuring cup right here. So I'm going to add the water at 40 degrees to 50 milliliters. Okay, and now what we're basically going to do is add the yeast, and it'll start sort of eventually it doesn't always want to go into the solution easily. But over time, it'll start getting milky. Now, you're supposed to leave it in here for about 15 minutes. That's the process of hydrating the yeast. Get some kind of a little spoon and try to break up the clumps, stir it. You know, you can leave it sit for a minute or two, come back and stir it again, and, you know, kind of like just work with it over the 15 minutes. And while this is sort of getting hydrated, I'm going to show you the other important thing that we do when we're getting ready to pitch the yeast in the must is we're going to talk about aeration. Okay, we have the must in the bucket here. The yeast has been hydrated, 50 milliliters in our little, you know, container. We're working on that. That needs 15 minutes. This is the point at which I do my aeration. Take the lid off, and we have in this strawberry rhubarb, remember we have a bag in here which contains most of the pulp, and then we have the liquid. And I like to leave the bag in when I do the fermentations. I try to get the yeast all mixed in there. I maybe even put a little bit inside the bag. But here's the tool for aeration. It's basically a mixer with like an egg beater or a beater on the front of it. Now basically, all you got to do is get that in there. Now I'm going to show you the process probably close up inside the bucket. But basically, you got to whip air into the liquid. And you should do it for at least 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes if you feel like comfortable doing it. You want as much air as you can get into this liquid so that when you add the yeast and you get ready for the start the fermentation, the yeast have plenty of oxygen, and that's very important for a good fermentation. Okay, it is time to pitch the yeast. Here's the yeast, hydrated, stirred up a little bit. I can see lots of foam in the must inside the bucket. I've been beating it for at least 5 minutes. So the foam is a good indication that you've got a lot of aeration in there. Stirring up the yeast, it looks milky. I don't see any clumps, so that's all good. When I add the yeast, I'm going to add a little bit inside this bag where the pulp is, just to make sure it gets in there. And then I'm just going to dump the rest into the must. And then I am going to stir it up a little bit. We'll stir it up a little bit with the beater. Okay, let's just make sure the yeast gets distributed. Now with the nylon bag, I'm going to twist it up here. Make sure that it doesn't, the pulp doesn't get out. I'm tying a little knot in it. Okay. There we go. We got a nice knot in our nylon bag with the pulp. And we'll give it a few dunks. Now that's pretty much everything we need to ferment this must. This particular bucket does a pretty good job of sealing around the top. Some buckets don't have very good seals. But when you put it on, you should sort of feel the air escaping out the airlock. And I do. Make sure you get a good tight lid when you're doing this. Okay, and the only thing left to do is to take the top off the airlock. Now I do need to add a little bit of water in the airlock. So there is a fill line on this airlock. And this is distilled water too, so just to keep it clean. All right, so now with this sealed with the airlock on, you can see by pushing down the inner thing in there will raise up and then it'll bubble out. So nothing can get in, and as the yeast does its job fermenting, the carbon dioxide will build up in the upper chamber and then it'll bubble out through this airlock. And we're going to monitor that bubbling. In 2, 3, 4 days, I should see it start bubbling vigorously. And you'll smell it. Definitely a distinct smell to the fermentation, and kind of yeasty. And then we'll let that fermentation go on again for maybe week, 2 weeks until it slows down. They pretty much tell you you're getting to the end when it bubbles like 1 bubble every minute. So that's a pretty slow bubble, but that's where you want to get to. And then at that point, we'll come back and we'll talk about how to rack this mead into a jar so that we can start aging it and, working towards our finalization in 9 months.